Welcome back to SIGA's Female Leadership in Sports Summit. Ben Jacobs with you. We're about to start our final webinar of the day. All of the panels will be available in due course on YouTube. Check out the app as well, because you can donate to SIGA and help us champion sport integrity generally, but also very specifically in this field. We'll be using a fair proportion of the money to mentor young female leaders. And speaking of that, for those interested that are SIGA members, you can be connected to mentors in a special behind closed doors leadership session, which gets underway at noon tomorrow. So keep engaging with us. We're back as well tomorrow. The first live webinar starts at 2:00 GMT, but lots of stuff before that, including keynote speeches. The full schedule is available on the app and the website as well. And follow us on social media too. Our handle is SIG Alliance. So there's only one A in there. We're SIGA, but the handle is SIG Alliance. The two A's, as I said earlier, blend into each other. Let's move on to webinar 8, our final one on day 2. It's called Fair Play on and Off the Pitch, Athlete Activism. This one is an absolutely massive topic, and we've seen more athlete activism than ever during the COVID-19 pandemic. Marcus Rashford, for example, fighting for free school meals and winning that battle initially against the British government. And Sue Bird, of course, championing a political campaign called Vote Warnock, which helped Warnock win the Georgia runoff in the United States of America, the 4-time Seattle Storm champion. A big part of that, and the other WNBA players picking up upon that campaign, and it proved very effective as well. So athletes are very much starting to realize just how powerful their platforms are, particularly in digital spheres. And to discuss this and the digital element in particular, we've got a great panel on that digital front. Josh Hirschman, who is the managing director of a digital sports agency called 10 Toes Media. And then from the athlete perspective, we've got Sarah Gregorius, former New Zealand international and now an advisor for global policy and strategic relations at FIFPro. We've got Rachel Burford, who is the Harlequins captain and also an England international, and Angela Lachica, who is managing director of the Players Coalition at Lachica Sports and Entertainment Group. Really excited for this one. And our moderator is the senior advisor at CSM Sport and Entertainment. It is a very good evening to Dan Mannix. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much for the nice introduction. I wish I didn't have as much gray in my beard. You're sporting the nice beard, and you did a great job with the introductions. I think the thing I will say, since we're talking about athlete activism, is Sarah, having played in 100 matches for New Zealand, 34 goals over a 10-year career, pretty amazing. 2 Olympic Games, 3 FIFA World Cups. And Rachel, as we speak, has broken away from practice. We may, if we're lucky, get some other players in the background as she snuck away to join. And 4 World Cups, pretty amazing, current captain, and is also, we'll get into further, has set up a program to get girls into rugby. Just wanted to call that out as we talk about athlete activism, athletes that are continuing to find their voices. So let's start and just go around the horn. And Angela, I'll start with you. There's so much going on with athletes and sports now and change in the last year and a half. What's been most inspiring to you that you've seen that's encouraging in terms of the social change and the voices that athletes are finding? If there was an example that's been encouraging to you, what would that be?
Sure, Dan, thank you. I think, our work started 5 years ago when athlete activism was not popular, particularly starting in the NFL. And so we were working with a group of a small handful of players who were really risking their careers when they were going to speak out. And I think back then what was most inspiring was our group worked with the NFL and negotiated and told them how they needed to view social justice and athlete activism, and ended up negotiating an $89 million commitment out of the NFL to put towards these issues, and not just a financial commitment, but also using their platform. So since then, it's been a tough battle those last 4 years, but once the Ahmaud Arbery murder happened here in the United States and the George Floyd murder happened here in the United States, we saw a significant influx of athlete activism. And fortunately, we were in a position to be a lot of people's first phone call. And I think what's been most inspiring from that is in the last 8 months, we've grown up to almost 1,500 professional athletes. And we now have leaders in 10 different professional sports here that are working in the Players Coalition. But in addition to that, we're now starting to see some support from the leagues that we never saw before. And we're in a really good position to help those athletes navigate those conversations with the league and then bring together their consolidated efforts to focus on these legislative issues that are frankly very racist in many areas, and consolidate those efforts and collective platforms for real systemic change.
Super. Well, I would definitely want to get back to, as we discussed, Angela, some of the changes that leagues have doing, and that 89 million and the commitment from the NFL is fantastic. And I think even looking at today's athletes, when you think of who was brave and who paved the way, so to speak, because it's a very different time now from when Colin Kaepernick first kneeled to what athletes finding their voices. So Sarah, you've been in an interesting spot of having, just retired in the midst of 2020, a crazy year of athlete activism, and now working with the Players Union as a strategic advisor. What's your perspective on this? What's just motivated you, whether an individual or a team or a story that's come out that's really gives you hope for what's moving forward?
Yeah, cheers, Dan. I think what we see a lot in our work at FIFPro and in my experience as a player myself is there's no lack of willingness for players to give back to their communities and to be activists and to really support positive social change. The Marcus Rashford example from earlier is a brilliant one, obviously, but there is so much more of that. And I think football has a bit of an image problem sometimes. I think the media and the public perception around the players is actually really far removed from how much they do care. And I think over the COVID period, we saw the immense willingness, generosity, whether it was of financial resources, time, spending time. I think we heard a lot of cases of players just literally going out and cooking meals for those in their communities that were trapped inside houses during the quarantine and lockdown periods. So I think that perception does need to change, and it needs to be, I think, an ongoing conversation that extends beyond just what has occurred last year and what Angela talked about the rising activism around social justice as well. So it's been a huge positive for me at a personal level to see that those stories are now getting a lot more airtime, because there are a lot of them. There is a long history of very close social engagement between players and communities, and certainly around activism with regards to societal issues. So that's a huge positive. I think we have still a long ways to go, and we need to keep elevating and making people aware of what is actually happening at that grassroots level in particular. So for me, that's been a huge positive, and I hope that it has shifted the perception, I think, of particularly football players. We represent at FIFPro over 65,000 players, and the ones that make the back pages are very, very, very pointy end of that spectrum. There is a whole large playing community that does a lot of really great work, and the more that we can highlight those efforts and see, I know it gets thrown around a lot, this sport for good and football for good type of mentality, but it's there. The work is being done, and it needs to be celebrated.
It's an interesting point you make. Not everybody's going to be on the back pages, but the grassroots movement of players and athletes coming together and doing their own activism that speaks to their values may not get the attention that some of the top athletes, but everything can have an impact. So Rachel, you're in the heart of it. You're with the team now. What's been inspiring to you, and actually jumping into one perspective of how does the dynamics of the locker room and other players or athletes' voices or perspective and potentially different perspectives impact how you find your voice?
I think what we've discovered over the last year is players are really finding their voice, and we're having conversations now, and we're having difficult conversations, and just being able to engage in those thoughts and understand the things that are going on in different entities, especially in rugby. We have so many different backgrounds, huge diversity differences, and for us to actually just start being open and talking about things and then challenging things, that's certainly been something that we've been digging deep into. There's still plenty more to be done, but it's definitely in the rugby landscape now, conversations are happening, and we're trying to progress forward to make positive change.
Super. And Josh, you come at it from a unique perspective of having worked for a league with UEFA, a team with Tottenham, and now with 10 Toes Media, which sounds like you have both feet on the ground perspective with that, which I'm curious where the origins of the name, but that's maybe a separate topic. But would love to hear, because you're working so closely with athletes on what they're doing in social media, what's your perspective and what's really been inspiring to you?
Yeah, more than happy to take you through the name another time. No, I think what's really interesting now is that we've got a world whereby athletes themselves have, in a lot of cases, bigger followings than clubs do. So they have their own platforms from which to speak, and they already have their voice, and it's just about using that voice in the right way and for the right cause, and in a genuine way as well. And I think, what we saw, sometimes the worst times bring out the best in people. And I think we saw, unfortunately, with what's happened with COVID, we saw, the Players Together movement as an example in the Premier League, where lots of players getting together to sort of fund NHS charities together and to help the NHS, just shows you what the collective power of athletes can be. And of course, you've got, as Sarah mentioned before, you've got a broad spectrum, where the very pointy end of that spectrum, that's what gets on the back pages. But you've got quite a deep roster of players below that across different clubs, different leagues, different sports, who do a lot of good stuff in the activism space. And just because, as I said, it doesn't necessarily reach the mainstream media, doesn't mean that it's not being done. But the biggest change now is that compared to 5 years ago, definitely 10 years ago, they now have their own platforms. They don't need to have a pal at a newspaper. They don't need a press conference to get their voice across. They can do it themselves on their socials, on their digital platforms, and really sort of start to make a difference and influence people from there.
Absolutely. And Ben mentioned at the start, Sue Bird, and you mentioned together, Sue Bird, along with Alex Morgan and some other athletes, have come together to form a new platform called Together, which is to increase coverage of women's sports, which hopefully continue to amplify the messages and the values and the important things that women athletes want to bring forward. So going back to the athlete perspective, Sarah or Rachel, either one of you jump in. What's been the dynamic or finding your voice as an athlete in the midst of the environment? I know the environment's been changing, but everything from, you could have a team owner who maybe has differing thoughts. Some of the things over the past years have been more where leagues or teams have tried to maybe repress the voices of athletes or control the message. And as Josh said, now there's all these platforms where the athlete can go direct through social media to engage fans. How did you find your voice, or did you feel those pressures, or did you always feel like you were supported and could speak up to what you believe in, whether on or off the field?
I can jump in first. I mean, it's a big question. I think for players, often their primary focus is to play, and they want to do that, and to risk or jeopardize the potential of that possibility is a really tough thing at an individual level and at a team level, if you decide to do something collectively around on-field activism and that type of thing. For me, at a personal level, I was always very confident in, I guess, the strength of my convictions. I was fortunate enough, though, to have an environment around me that was usually pretty good, but there was an occasion in my career where the environment failed us as a team, and we found our collective voice. It was a very difficult and challenging time. And I think that's where you mentioned, the repression that can sometimes occur around a sports team, where you want to suppress the athlete's ability to say things, or if it brings the clause in the contract around like bringing the organization into disrepute, which I hate. There is a little bit of fear, I think, that's drilled into players about like how they use their voice, when they use their voice. And it's all good when you're trying to send a positive message, right? Use your platform to send something that's overwhelmingly positive, that's going to, really shine a good light on a situation. But it can change a little bit. The dynamic can change when you probably want to do something that's maybe going to upset an owner, upset a sporting organization, maybe potentially like uproot the entire sport sometimes as well. So I think that there is still a reasonable amount of suppression that goes on. But to Josh's point, I think now athletes have the ability to work around those parameters, right? They have these platforms online. They can appear in an environment that SIGA has created right now, where they have an opportunity to speak their minds more freely. But I think we do always have to be wary of those pressures and understand that it takes a lot for players to leverage potentially their careers in order to speak out about something. So it's on also the governing bodies and the organizations around the players to create an environment that actually allows them to use their voice. I think that's still really critical.
Absolutely. I think it's so important, that point of the environment and feeling like you can actually speak your opinion and not have ramifications. Rachel, so 4 World Cups, you probably have a different perspective than an athlete who's coming in and on the Harlequins for the first time and going into their first experience on a national team. What are your thoughts on that? And were there any other players through your career that kind of gave you more confidence to say, hey, I can speak up, because you had some leaders who kind of paved the way for you?
Yeah, I echo Sarah on some of the points, like around, a lot of players do still have a fear factor about being able to stand up for something they may believe in or they feel right. I think we are starting to see a shift, but when I first came into the system, I wouldn't say boo to a goose, and I certainly wouldn't be raising any concerns that I may have had, but there were certainly individuals who were the leaders within the group who have got a voice, and collectively they work together. And I think that's the key thing in all of this is so often that you're not alone in what you may be thinking or have issues with, and that actually together we can do so much more and progress so much further. And I think, in my environment, certainly my experience, I've had to grow into that and find my way and have confidence to be able to speak out and to do what's right. But I think there's the right way to do things like that. And there can be the catastrophic wrong way to do it as well. And I think education around how to find your voice in the right way and make sure that it's delivered to be most impactful is really, really important, because I think sometimes if we get the messaging wrong, then the opportunity is lost. So I think a big education around how to land those messages, how to work collectively, and what using your voice can do. Like Josh has mentioned it so much about how powerful we are as players. At the end of the day, we are the product on the pitch, and we need to make sure that our concerns and our voices are heard. And how do we do that in a real joined up and collective way? Absolutely. And I'm curious, we're talking about the athlete's perspective, and Angela, Josh, working with athletes and leagues, a 17-year-old with microphones stuck in their face suddenly can be very intimidating. It's very different than someone who's in their 30s, who's been through more life experiences. What guidance or tips do you give to athletes that you're working with to how and where they should show up? And as Sarah said, they're ultimately at the highest level of sport and have to focus so much of their energies on that, or they're not going to be successful in their profession. So I'd love your thoughts on that. And also what tools or education, as Rachel mentioned, because it's so important for them to continue to gain awareness of what's going on.
Yeah, I think those are really good points, and I'm glad both Sarah and Rachel brought that up about the education and about the desire to want to use it. And so, again, going back when we first started and we were behind the scenes advising these players, the media was awful and just couldn't understand why these issues were important. And so we realized that we need to invest a lot of time behind the scenes to educate players on the issues and to make sure that they had evidence-based stats, and that we could point blank say, this is what we mean. And we really found ourselves having to define what social justice was, what criminal justice reform meant, what district attorney, accountability meant. So we found ourselves having to not only educate the players on the issues, so when they were in post-game interview locker rooms, they could say, because X number of juveniles are locked up for life, and we were able to just kind of retort back that, and that ended up really becoming the distinction between the success and the sustainability of our organization, and maybe not necessarily some other groups, but some other movements. And so with that education, the players then became very comfortable using their platforms, but we were careful to make sure we surrounded ourselves with subject matter experts. So I'm not an expert in police and community relations, but I know how to manage that group, and I know how to build those campaigns, bridging the experts and bridging the athletes. And so when we would get an opportunity, we made sure we vet it through experts. When we asked a player to tweet something, we made sure every word was vetted through an expert. And so we built this trust with our athletes to understand now when we're providing information, it's been through a long vetting process and we're ready to go. And it's very intentional. And our goal is to maximize the impact while minimizing players' times, because they're pulled in so many directions, as I'm sure Sarah and Richard could tell you. And so it was really important to us. And now, we're 4 or 5 years into this, and we have 10 to 12 legislative wins that we can point to. Here in the States, we were able to restore voting rights for returned citizens in Florida. And here in Florida, that's 1.4 million people, and Florida swings an election. Those are some major numbers. We were able to lobby for $1.4 billion into the Massachusetts public school system. So we really use those player platforms for a larger call to action, and having sweeping numbers to be able to impact the communities really strategically.
That's amazing, and sounds like amazing impact. And I think so important in terms of when you're talking about getting it right with what information they're putting out there, so they have the credibility to audiences. So Angela, you work with a lot of sports leagues, or you have over the years. What aspect of this change and the sports leagues, using their platforms, using their broadcast and media and digital channels to bring attention to Black Lives Matter, other issues, how much of that do you think will continue and they'll lean into that and accelerate that? Or will there be a pulling back from that because they feel like, oh, that moment's passed and we need to get back to business? Is there going to be some regression of that awareness of use of platforms? Or what do you think the responsibility of leagues and using their platforms for social justice?
Well, I think, with NFL, I think the NFL, the original goal when we went to the commissioner was we wanted social justice to be equal with breast cancer awareness, with Military Awareness Month. We wanted it to be a part of what their pillars were and raising awareness and impact in those communities. And with that, when we first went to the league, it wasn't just about money, like I had mentioned, it was about their platform. And we said, we need you to talk about these issues on your social media. We need you to talk about these issues in your PSA. And it took a few years to get there, but not this Super Bowl, but last year's Super Bowl, after all of the work with the players, we were able to have Anquan Bolden, who was one of the co-founders of the Players Coalition. He lost his cousin as his cousin was pulled over and his car was broke down on the side of the road. He was on the phone with roadside, and an off-duty police officer came and gave him a hard time and shot and killed him. And it was recorded, all recorded by roadside assistance. And that officer lied about it. Well, as Anquan recognized his platform in Florida, he was able to see that case brought attention and then understood what he could do with his platform. So fast forward 5 years, when we're talking to the NFL and we're trying to get them to understand why social justice is important and how it goes beyond just throwing money at organizations, they ended up listening, and they aired a PSA of Anquan Bolden's story during Super Bowl, during the largest show, globally. That was a big deal because they were talking about police brutality, the NFL was, during Super Bowl. And so that's what we meant by support. We want your name in this. We want you to tell us that this is important. So going back to your original question, I think the NFL, I think social justice is going to be a cornerstone of what their focus is now. The other leagues, it's funny, we're on just something as simple as a group chat. We call it the Leaders Across Leagues, and we have 15 or so professional athletes from the WNBA, NBA, MLB, soccer, softball, NFL, and we're all in a group chat and we talk about best practices. They go, okay, what are you guys gonna do for the anthem today? Well, our league is saying this. And so we're trying to figure out where all the other leagues are, because some of them seem very far behind, and some of them are just up against a battle of just getting the league to understand even what racism is. And so I don't know where the other leagues are going to be long term, but I do know that the players that we work with, we're going to do everything we can to make sure that we're equipping those players with the resources they need to go to their leagues and say, this is why this is important, and stay on them, and making sure we're taking advantage of all those resources available.
Well, it's exciting and encouraging hearing of the sharing of best practices and collaborations that's happening across leagues that may not have happened in the past. Josh, you referenced in talking prior to the conference the kind of bottom up and the keeping a pulse of what the fans are looking for and different social platforms. What trends are you seeing in that, and organizations being receptive to that grassroots aspect of information coming from different sources, and what still needs to change in that space?
Yeah, so I think we're seeing, as I kind of mentioned previously, we're seeing a lot of players and athletes now understanding that whether they've got 10,000, 100,000 or 10 million followers, they can still have an impact. And whether that's on one person's life, 10 people's lives, or as Angela mentioned, going all the way up to the leagues and staying on them. Like, I think athletes are understanding now that they can have a real impact right the way from a grassroots level all the way up to institutional changes, into how the way that leagues see things, the way that broadcasters do things. They can really have that impact. I mean, one example we saw recently, or one piece of work rather that we did recently, starts with us and starts for us with really understanding the players that we get to know. And again, Angela touched on it in terms of like an educational point of view. For us, we're working with athletes. It's about helping them understand themselves as well, helping them understand what causes they genuinely care and feel passionate about, because everyone can't talk about everything and you can't fight every battle. You have to look inside yourself, understand yourself. And that's the point that we talked about earlier, from a 17-year-old with a microphone shoved in front of them, all the way through to a 30-year-old or someone who's on the verge of retiring. It's really that they need to have gone on that journey to understand themselves and understand what causes they feel passionate about, that they can then, and the word authentic is often thrown around and misused, but I prefer to use the word genuine. If an athlete can feel genuine passion to want to drive change and want to have a real impact, then that is the perfect starting point and the perfect touch point to then be able to take them on a wider journey. Now, we work with a couple of players who play for Chelsea over here, so Pernilla Harder and Magdalena Eriksson, who are actually a couple and they play within the same team. There was a very famous photo of them kissing after a World Cup match because Pernilla was there supporting Magdalena, and we've gone on this journey with them around supporting LGBT rights, for example. And there was I would say very small, probably does it a disservice, but an activation with them recently where on Valentine's Day, instead of talking about their love for each other and their relationship, they actually opened up their DMs to anybody who was struggling in that word, and not only in sort of the LGBT world, but anybody who was struggling could come to them, because they understood that for some people it's a lonely day, for some people it's a difficult day. They referenced directly being able to come out to friends or family, and they're using their social platform as a way to directly maybe influence one person's life, because they could send them a DM and they would get a response and they could have a genuine conversation. Of course, there was some not nice replies as well. And actually, again, to Angela's point, surrounding them with the right people to then advise them what should they do if they get a reply which isn't what they had hoped for or what they wanted to do, what they wanted to receive rather. And it actually led to a couple of responses saying, I don't want fans like you. Feel free to unfollow me, because actually that is as powerful a message as what they're actually doing by inviting the DMs in. So you start to see that something relatively small and a gesture of really just giving their time. I should add, they actually had a game that day as well. So it was after a match, and then once they've got home in the evening as well. So again, that's where, as I mentioned, you have to really know yourself and feel genuinely passionate to do it. Otherwise, it can become quite transparent very quickly if you're just trying to put your name to something that you don't feel passionate about.
Absolutely. As Nelson Mandela said, sport has the power to change the world and unite people in a way that many things don't. And Angela touched on this with the Players Coalition, which I love coming together. Sarah, Rachel, again, from the athlete's perspective, and now Sarah, you're thrown into this big role working with the Players Union. What what's inspiring for you specifically in women's sports? Like who's stepping up and doing things that you're like, this is going to be some of the impact and legacy for the next generation of female athletes, and also young girls and teenagers seeing representatives, someone who reminds them of themselves, making a stand or speaking up for what they believe in?
I think there's a lot to choose from in women's sport. I don't think we're short of role models in that sense. Obviously, Josh touched on a couple that he knows very well. I think there's a lot. I also think it just depends on what the individual maybe gravitates towards, right? Because there's a lot of players doing a lot of fantastic work and they use their podiums and platforms really strongly. I think what I see in women's football in particular and in women's sport is, yes, there's an opportunity to speak up on social justice issues. Yes, there's an opportunity to be a visible role model, whether it's for LGBTQ plus visibility and rights and that type of thing. But there's also a huge amount of change that needs to happen within women's sport and within women's football. So I think there's also an element or a discussion to be had around industrial action that athletes take within their own sports. So I give you a really good example is there was a couple of instances of on-field activism by a couple of women's national teams in the lead up to the 2019 Women's World Cup. So the Puerto Rican women's national team and the Argentinian women's national team. And I don't know if there were conversations between those two playing groups, but they did something very similar, where before their World Cup qualifying games, they, instead of like standing and smiling with their arms around each other for the pre-game team photo, they held up their hands to their ears because they wanted attention from their federation. So they used and seized upon that moment. And I find that particularly inspiring because I think we also lose sight of the fact that there is a lot of change that just needs to happen within the sport. And sometimes the catalyst for that change is the athletes themselves. And it shouldn't be, right? We should be striving as governing bodies and sporting organizations to just do a better job for the athletes, because as Rachel said, they are the product on the pitch. There is no sport without players. There's no talent, there's no commercial revenue without the extraordinary talent that we see. So I'm, at a personal level, I'm particularly inspired by the industrial action and the industrial activism that takes place, but I mean also hugely motivated by the examples of like the Megan Rapinos of the world, Naomi Osaka, Serena Williams, like the ones that really break down barriers, because sometimes just being yourself is an act of protest, right? Because you're just showing the world that you belong by the force of your willingness to be there. So that's truly inspiring. But I also think that within women's football and within women's sport, there is still such a need for just change to happen there, as well as all of this amazing social justice and visibility and role modeling that we see as well.
It's interesting, as you mentioned, Osaka and Serena, it's exciting to see actually women's investment in women's professional sports, as they've both made investments to become owners in NWSL teams, along with Natalie Portman and others. Rachel, any thoughts on that to add from the perspective of the athlete?
Yeah, no, I think there's been some really inspiring work that has gone on, and just looking within our league and around the Black Lives Matter movement, we had open discussions about that we've never done before, but there's a point where we're doing something, but we're still not doing something, if that makes sense. We're making a bit of a stand, but what's the action? What's the follow-up? And that's the next thing. And that's how you make change, by taking action. And they're probably the next steps where we need to get to. But like I echo Sarah in terms of, we've got so many fantastic role models within the game who are doing a lot and who are paving the way and giving others the courage to do the same. And I would 100% put Serena up there, and Judy Murray and Alex Scott, and people who were not prepared to put themselves out there for other people.
Well, and you mentioned action, and I'm curious, Rule 50, that ability to protest during the Olympics. It's going to be interesting to see what happens during the Olympics. And as the statements that have been made on the field by female athletes and athletes overall are fantastic and have been powerful, someone can make a huge statement at the Olympics, maybe it goes viral, and it's this moment in time of a blip of something. And how do we enact, and Angela, I know you're working a lot with this with the Players Coalition, how do we take it to the next level where it's not just a statement on the field or even off the field through a social channel, to enact change and long-lasting change and mobilize others within the industry to get behind that?
Yeah, I think, you know, here in the States, when we're working with the athletes in that call to action, we kind of have a multi-prong approach. You know, the first could be just kind of educating people. If you're gonna speak out against something, you know, give people a solution on what they can do or an action item. So it could be something as simple as, you know, donate to these organizations that are fighting issues like mass incarceration, or addressing the education equity here in the States. It could be supporting Black-owned businesses or banks. But then when we're, you know, I know the Players Coalition, I think part two of what our work is pretty progressive on a legislative level. So when the George Floyd murder happened, you know, there was tons of outcry, of obviously just awful. And so beyond going just on social media and kind of speaking the feelings and speaking from the heart, we said, okay, well, what is this call to action now? We looked at the root of the problem. Why was that monster allowed to do what he did? How was he still on the police force? And this couldn't have been his first time with an incident like this, right? So we start to look at what in the system failed George Floyd, what in the system is failing so many people. And so we go to our subject matter experts, and we find that legislation. And here in the United States, it was qualified immunity for police officers. It's the only industry that has qualified immunity. You know, if a doctor messes up, they don't get a second chance. You know, if a lawyer messes up, they get disbarred. So we ended up drafting a letter to Congress and asking to end qualified immunity. We had over 1,500 front office support signatures on it, player support, league support. It struck a huge chord, and it really galvanized everyone here in the United States, I think, because we were able to provide a solution. This is what our ask is now after we saw that. Same with something like with Breonna Taylor here in the United States. We're asking now for a no-knock warrant, which was part of the legislative issue that the cops were able to get off and with her murder, and even using language like murder. It was a murder, you know. And so what we try to really make sure that we're using every opportunity to not only, again, go on to the legislative side, but also to try to change the framework of how people are viewing these incidences, and how the racism is absolutely there and is part of our system here.
Well, Angela, kudos to you. By the way, my facial response was not to what you were saying, which was a very serious, important subject. It was to that amazing cat that strolled behind you, which is awesome. And the beauty of Zoom calls versus boring formal conferences in ballrooms. I think, I mean, what you just said is like the best example of actually sport having the power to impact change within society and politics and government within our communities. So kudos to you with what you're doing on that front. I'm going to read one. Oh, sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. But, you know, I understand that a lot of what I was speaking with was like United States focused, but if I could add something on the education piece, which is absolutely a global issue. One of our education pillars, we here during COVID, it really exposed the digital divide here and the lack of connectivity and how it disproportionately impacted our Black and Brown students. And so part of that call to action was also meetings with the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission here, and getting them, you know, once we found out that they were a Kansas City Chiefs fan. And so we gathered our Kansas City Chiefs players and we said, hey, we're going to have a private phone call with the elected official, and we're going to tell them why this is important. And so what Sarah and Rachel have are platforms where people will pick up the phone because of who they are. Sorry about the cat.
Absolutely. I've worked in sports my whole life. And the fact that Sarah has scored 34 goals and Rachel is captain, that's inspiring. Like that's inspiring to so many people because of the impact sports can have in individual lives.
Right.
And I do want to touch on, Rachel, your girls rugby program and what the inspiration was for that for the next generation. I want to call out one question from the audience and encourage people at home or wherever you are to submit through the app any questions. But this question came in from Aline Candeo, Sport Ethics and Integrity Master's student from KU Leuven Curitiba. I'm totally probably butchering that, so I apologize. The question is it right to say that activism is becoming an intrinsic part of women's sports? Is it right to say that activism is becoming an intrinsic part of women's sports? Open to anyone to answer that. Josh?
Oh, Sarah, I saw Sarah on mute at the same time. So if Sarah, you want to take it by all means.
No, please go ahead.
I mean, it's interesting that Sarah was the other one that I muted because I was going to reference the point that Sarah made before. It's becoming an intrinsic part of sport generally. But I think, the point that Sarah made before about there being wider sort of industrial change that's driven within women's sport, as well as that, is a point that's really paramount. I mean, that shouldn't be overlooked because I guess the need for activism will be less when women's sport gets to a better place, referencing the industrial action that was mentioned before, and when it is a more level playing field, you have fewer issues to contend with. There will always be issues that come up along the way, but certainly I think it is a part more so of sport generally. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that any form of activism that prompts good change, whether, as I said, that's at a really micro level of helping one person in the world, or a macro level of law changes and big administrative changes as well, then it's a good thing. So we should be encouraging it across all sport, and in women's sport especially, for sure.
Absolutely. And I think the more women's sports gets coverage, exposure, scale through media, through brand partners, through sponsor support, we need more Nike supporting women's sports. Vitality in the UK has been amazing at supporting women's sports, and Nick Reed's coming up later today. And then the giving back aspect. And Rachel, I'd love to talk about, what sparked you to create your girls rugby program? Was it because of the lack of opportunity when you were growing up? What was the impetus for that?
Yeah, you've completely hit the nail on the head there. It's just the lack of opportunity. So we want to create pathways through the Girls Rugby Club for girls as young as 7 all the way through to senior rugby. I grew up playing in an all boys team, and when I looked to left and right of me across the field, there wasn't many girls around. So even though I loved my sport, it was still quite a lonely place. So we want to try and inspire and give girls, young girls, a place that's theirs, and somewhere they can feel very comfortable and confident and, feel part of something. And so that's kind of the inspiration behind it. I'm sure anybody who's involved in sport, and I'm sure Sarah will echo the same thing, I owe so much to the game, and it's almost I want to give back as much as I can. And we'll fight over which sport is the better sport, but just getting people active and young and into team sports is huge. And it's really, really passion of mine that I want young girls to pick up a rugby ball and find all the greatness that I have over my career.
That's awesome. Well, for any brands that are listening, I think that I personally would jump on. I wish I worked at a brand, and I'd be jumping on talking to you and Sarah about being spokespersons, because there's so many amazing stories, and kudos to what you're doing in terms of creating that opportunity. And I'm biased. I've had the fortunate to work on Athletes Unlimited, which is 3 new professional women's sports leagues that are starting in the States. And a lot of the discussions of the athletes are being able to create role models or be role models for young girls coming up so they can have a pathway to professional sports. Another question from the audience. This one is from Meredith Benson, close by. I'm in Brooklyn, New York. She's in New Haven, Connecticut, a strategist with Athlete Voices. How do athletes really impact change in the mindset within front office leaders? So whether that's the executives with your club or leagues or the owners, what are thoughts on that?
I mean, maybe I can speak because I sort of have taken that step from playing into football administration. I think it's twofold. I think there's a lot of, I think players don't really know how to take that next step. I mean, I personally was shoulder tapped, which made it a hell of a lot easier, because I think if I saw the advertisement for my job that I have now on the internet, I don't think I would have applied. because I think there's a lot of exclusion that takes place, particularly for women. They sort of take themselves out of the conversation, where men seem to feel a lot more empowered to maybe sell themselves a little bit more strongly. So I think that that's one part of it. Athletes need to recognize how strong their skills that they've developed over their playing careers are and how they can transfer into the workforce, particularly front office for sports. And I think the other part of it is there's a huge disconnect sometimes. What I find frustrating, what I've certainly found frustrating in my post-sports career, is the diversity that we see in the playing community is not reflected in the halls of power in the organizations that are setting the systems and the structures around the game. And that's why sometimes the playing experience can be so, damaging and discriminatory at the very extreme level, because the system hasn't been built by those that are going to use it. So I think players recognize that, and they feel the impact of these decisions, but they can't access the decision-making corridors. And that's a huge problem. And I think all sports industries suffer in that regard. So I would just, anytime that I'm given an opportunity to speak at something like this, I just encourage others to seek those opportunities, to say yes during your playing career to really help set yourself up, but also to the sporting organizations. The talent is there. Like, go out and identify it, put programs in place to start that pipeline, to get them into your front office, to get them into the boardroom, to get them into those structures and those systems that at the moment still feel so removed from the playing community. Because I think all sport, football, rugby, like the ones that you're developing over there, Dan, I think they'll all benefit from more diversity in the decision making and more presence of people within that system, of the ones who have experienced the game firsthand.
Sarah, you just hit on so many important subjects, and I love the tap on the shoulder, right? And the industry needs allies across all fields to tap more people on the shoulder. As well as there's such a lack of diversity in the business side of sports business that is an issue that is now somewhat being addressed more, but there's hopefully going to be continued action in that area to have more perspectives and diverse perspectives, and hopefully more athletes like yourself in the transition into the sports business. We have so many other questions coming in now, but we, of course, as they're coming in, we're out of time. So I just want to thank Sarah, Angela, Rachel, and Josh. Amazing. Rachel, say hi to your teammates for us. Keep doing what all of you are doing in terms of the impact it's having on athletes' voices, on sports organizations overall, and particularly on the nonprofit organizations that you're all involved with. And Angela, the Players Coalition sounds amazing in terms of the tangible impact it's having within communities. So thank you so much to all of you. We'll try and answer some more of these questions through some of the other channels, and hopefully they'll get answered throughout the sessions with SIGA. So thank you so much. Enjoyed the conversation and look forward to continuing the discussion.
Hey everyone, it's Karen Core from the United States, currently working at Lakeshore Foundation as their Policy and Public Affairs Coordinator. I'm also currently a SIGA champion and on their SIGA Standing Committee on Gender, Race, Inclusion, and Diversity. What should sports organizations do to co-power girls and women in sport? Well, as a disabled woman in sport, my question is, what can sports organizations do to co-power disabled women and girls in sport? Well, the first thing that we can do is recognize that the inclusion and participation of women and girls with disabilities in sport is a global responsibility. The second thing that we can do is to provide women and girls with more opportunities for competitive and recreational sport. The third thing that we can do is involve women and girls with disabilities in all outreach programs. The fourth thing, showcase and have meaningful and impactful representation of disabled women and girls as successful athletes, successful coaches, successful role models, and successful leaders. And lastly, let us continue to include and prioritize disabled women and girls in governance and decision-making opportunities. Looking forward to expanding this conversation. Talk soon.
Hello, my name is Michelle Chai. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the Olympic Council of Malaysia, and I'm also a mentor on the SIGA Women Global Mentorship Program.
Hello, my name is Maysab Saivis from Lebanon. I am a former Lebanese table tennis champion and currently a table tennis coach at Antonia University for physical education students, and I am a mentee on the SIGA Women Global Mentorship Program.
Throughout my 20 over years in sports, I've been fortunate enough to shadow some fantastic leaders, both male and female. Being able to have someone that I can always refer to not only gave me the confidence to chart my own path, but there was always someone available to be my sounding board and to nudge me in the right direction. Programs such as the SIGA Women Global Mentorship Program is crucial in encouraging young leaders to explore and push their boundaries within a safe environment. I urge all sports organizations to replicate such programs and atmospheres within their organization.
For me, organizations must focus on community girls program at the grassroots level. It providing coaching and mentoring programs like SIGA Women will result in women investing mental and physical knowledge in the world of sports. Coming from the Middle East, women face difficulties in sports. Women involvement in sports is ignored, as sports represents a risk of ethics, moral, and religious beliefs. The only future of changing the point of view of cultures and societies towards women representation and leadership in sports is time.
I'm really happy to be on the SIGA Women Global Mentorship Program with Mesa, who's an exceptional young female leader. I'm looking forward to sharing and exchanging my ideas with her.
Thank you, SIGA Women, for this excellent program and the opportunity to connect with Michelle. I am sure I will benefit from her experience.
Hello, my name is Sarah Soleiman-Ley. I work at FIFA in the governance department for the member associations of FIFA. I'm a SIGA mentor within the SIGA Global Women Mentorship Program, and today I'm with my mentee Taryn.
Hi everyone, I'm Taryn Horner, a mentee on the program and also the sport engagement lead at Newham College of Further Education in London. We welcome you to the Web Summit on Female Sport Leadership, and we hope that you enjoy the week with us.
Great. So, Taryn, what do you think should sport organizations do to empower girls in sport?
Thanks, Sarah. This is such an important topic of discussion, and I think that it's highly important that all sports organizations and foundations are inclusive towards women and girls, and specifically towards the youth, because that's where we can have the most developmental impact. So it's highly important that sports organizations consider women's needs separate to those of their male counterparts, and that they provide opportunities for women to be their best and reach their potential within sport and the development objectives.
Well, that was great, Taryn. Thanks a lot. And do not forget to follow SIGA.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the week with us and use the hashtag SIGAWomen. Like, share, and follow.
Hi, I'm Jerice Colon, CEO of the U.S. Center for Safe Sport. I am so very excited to participate in SIGA's Summit on Female Leadership in Sport, especially this March during Women's History Month. SIGA has brought together an incredible group of professional athletes, advocates, and those who support sport together to really talk about some of the tough issues that each of us encounter. So I hope you will join us March 8th through 10th. I'll see you there.
Hello, my name is Marily Flores. I'm Women's Tournaments Manager at FIFA, and I am a mentor on the SIGA Women Global Mentorship Program. Welcome to the SIGA Web Summit on Female Mentorship in Sports. I think that this program is very helpful because we can give our mentees the opportunity and also the tools that will help them to lead in this industry.
Hello, my name is Carla Hernandez Valdez. I'm from Mexico City. I'm a sales planner at Under Armour, and I'm a mentee on the SIGA Women Global Mentorship Program. Welcome to the SIGA Web Summit on Female Mentorship in Sports. SIGA Women Global Mentorship Program gives me the opportunity to develop my leadership skills and grow my network. SIGA Women.
Hello, my name is Dr. Lindsay Sarah Krasnoff. I'm a historian and research associate with the Center for International Studies and Diplomacy at SOAS University of London, and I'm a mentor for the SIGA Women Global Mentorship Program.
Hi, my name is Bethany Hushin, and I am a community manager at iSport Connect and also a part-time PhD student with the Institute of Sport Business at Loughborough University in London. And I am a mentee on the SIGA Women Global Mentorship Programme.
Among the many things that sports organizations can do to empower girls in sports is to be authentic, be engaging, be inclusive, but importantly, to grant them the space and the opportunity to thrive and take ownership.
Mentorship programs like this one are really important, especially as a good way for people to learn off each other from different experiences, different knowledge, different backgrounds, and also to give a bit of an insight in terms of how people have faced challenges within working in sport and how we can face them, not just individually, but together.
We hope you enjoyed the summit.
#SIGA Women.